It was one of those lazy Sunday afternoons when the sunlight streamed through my kitchen window, casting golden patterns across the counter. I'd been living in this apartment complex for about 6 months, long enough to exchange polite nods with most of my neighbors, but not quite long enough to form any meaningful connections. That's just how city life tends to be sometimes. We live stacked on top of each other, yet somehow maintain these invisible boundaries. I'm Alex, by the way, 32, relatively new to the neighborhood, and on this particular day, embarking on an ambitious cooking project that had my entire apartment smelling like a blend of garlic, herbs, and possibility. I've always found solace in cooking. There's something meditative about the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the sizzle of oil in a hot pan, and the gradual transformation of individual ingredients into something greater than the sum of their parts. Maybe that's why I decided to tackle this complicated recipe from my grandmother's collection, a hearty stew that required patience, attention, and apparently, more salt than I had on hand. Just as I was realizing my salt container was nearly empty, there was a knock at my door. Timing has a funny way of working out sometimes, doesn't it? When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with the guy from apartment 4B, the one with the infectious laugh I'd occasionally hear through the walls, the one who always seemed to be carrying a book when I passed him in the hallway. "Hey there, neighbor," he said with an easy smile that immediately put me at ease. "I'm Daniel. We haven't officially met, but I think it's about time we did." His eyes were a warm hazel color that seemed to shift in the hallway lighting, and he had this way of standing, confident but not imposing, that made me instantly comfortable. "Alex," I replied, extending my hand. "Nice to finally meet you properly." "Something smells amazing," Daniel said, peering past me into my apartment. "I've been smelling it for the past hour and finally worked up the courage to investigate." "What are you cooking?" I explained about my grandmother's stew recipe, and before I knew it, I was inviting him in. There was something about Daniel that felt familiar, like we'd known each other in some past life. He followed me into the kitchen, where my pot was simmering away, the contents bubbling gently. "Actually," I admitted, "I'm in a bit of a cooking crisis. I just realized I'm almost out of salt, and this recipe definitely needs more." I was about to head out to the store, but, "Say no more," Daniel interrupted, his face lighting up. "Neighborly rescue mission activated. I've got plenty of salt. Let me run back to my place and grab some for you." Before I could properly thank him, he was already heading toward the door. "Don't let that beautiful creation burn. I'll be right back," he called over his shoulder. True to his word, Daniel returned minutes later, a small container of sea salt in hand. "Your cooking salvation has arrived," he announced with a theatrical bow that made me laugh. There was something refreshingly unguarded about him. In a city where everyone seems to wear their urban armor, Daniel seemed perfectly comfortable just being himself. "You're a lifesaver," I said, taking the salt from him. "Would you like to stay for a bit? It's the least I can offer for your heroic salt delivery." Daniel's smile widened. "I thought you'd never ask. Besides, I'm invested in this stew now. I need to know how it turns out." As I returned to the stove, Daniel leaned against the counter, watching me cook with genuine interest. He asked questions about the recipe, about my grandmother, about my love for cooking. There's something intimate about letting someone into your kitchen space, into the rhythm of your cooking process. It's like giving them a glimpse into a personal ritual. "So you learned to cook from your grandmother?" he asked, his eyes following my movements as I added a pinch of his salt to the pot. "She was my greatest teacher," I explained, stirring slowly. "Not just about food, but about life. She always said cooking is an act of love. You're literally creating nourishment for someone else." I paused, suddenly self-conscious about waxing philosophical about cooking to someone I'd just met. But Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "I like that perspective. My family wasn't big on cooking together, but I've always been drawn to kitchens. There's an honesty to them, don't you think? People are their most authentic selves when they're cooking or eating." I looked at him, surprised by the observation. "I've never thought about it that way, but you're right. Food breaks down barriers." The conversation flowed easily as the stew continued to simmer. I learned that Daniel was a literature professor at the local university, which explained all the books. He had moved to the building about a year ago after a relationship ended, seeking a fresh start. There was something refreshing about his openness, the way he shared details of his life without hesitation or calculation. As I stirred the stew, Daniel moved closer, the scent drawing him in. That smells incredible, he said, his shoulder brushing against mine. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. Mind if I take a closer look at the master at work? Be my guest, I replied, stepping slightly aside to make room for him at the stove. The proximity was making my heart beat a little faster, though I tried to focus on the task at hand. Daniel peered into the pot, inhaling deeply. The color is beautiful, rich and deep. What's your secret? Time, I said simply. And patience. You can't rush a good stew. Words to live by, Daniel murmured, his gaze shifting from the pot to my face. There was a moment, just a brief one, where our eyes met, and something unspoken passed between us. I felt a flutter in my stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. It needs a taste test, I said, breaking the moment. I reached for a spoon, but Daniel stopped me with a gentle touch on my wrist. May I? He asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Before I could respond, he dipped his finger into the edge of the pot where the stew wasn't too hot, stirring gently before bringing his finger to his lips. I should have been appalled. It was, after all, a flagrant violation of kitchen hygiene. But there was something so spontaneous, so playful about the gesture that I found myself laughing instead. That's definitely not how my grandmother taught me to taste test, I said, trying to sound stern but failing miserably. Daniel's eyes crinkled at the corners as he grinned. Sometimes the best experiences come from breaking the rules a little. He licked his lips appreciatively. And that, my new friend, is absolutely delicious. Though I might be biased since my salt is the star ingredient. Your salt does deserve an honorable mention, I conceded, finding myself mirroring his smile. But I think there's a bit more to it than that. You're right, Daniel agreed, his voice softening. It's the hands that prepare it. There's care in this stew. I can taste it. The compliment warmed me more than I expected. Cooking had always been my form of self-expression, my way of connecting with others. Having someone recognize that felt surprisingly validating. Would you like to stay for dinner? I heard myself asking before I'd fully processed the thought. It'll be ready in about 20 minutes, and it's always better shared. Daniel's expression was one of genuine pleasure. I'd love nothing more. On one condition, though. What's that? I asked, curious. Let me help set the table. I'm a salt provider and an excellent table setter. And just like that, my solitary cooking adventure transformed into something entirely different. Daniel moved around my kitchen with ease, finding plates and utensils as if he'd been there before. There was a comfortable domesticity to it all, the kind that usually takes months or years to develop with someone. As we worked side by side, our movements began to synchronize naturally. When I reached for the pepper, Daniel was already handing it to me. When he needed space to arrange the place settings, I instinctively stepped aside. It was like a dance we somehow both knew the steps to, despite never having practiced. So, Alex, Daniel said as he folded napkins with surprising precision, tell me something I wouldn't guess about you. I considered the question while giving the stew one final stir. I used to be terrified of cooking for other people. I'd get so anxious about whether they'd like it that I'd sometimes ruin perfectly good dishes by second-guessing myself. And now, Daniel asked, leaning against the counter again, his full attention on me. Now I understand that cooking for someone is an offering, not a performance. If it's made with care, that's what matters most. I shrugged. At least, that's what I tell myself when I'm feeling nervous. Are you nervous now? Daniel's question was gentle, perceptive. I looked up from the pot, meeting his gaze. A little, I admitted, but in a good way. Something shifted in the air between us, a recognition, perhaps, that this wasn't just about borrowed salt or a spontaneous dinner. There was a connection forming, delicate but undeniable. Daniel stepped closer, reaching past me to turn down the heat on the stove. Let it simmer, he said softly, his arm brushing against mine. Some things can't be rushed. The double meaning wasn't lost on me. I felt a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the steam rising from the pot. As we finally sat down to eat, the stew now perfectly seasoned and served in my grandmother's old bowls, I watched Daniel take his first proper spoonful. His eyes closed briefly as he savored it, and the expression of pleasure on his face was its own reward. This, he declared, is exactly what I needed today. Maybe even what I've needed for a long time without realizing it. We talked through the entire meal, our conversation ranging from childhood memories to favorite books to travel dreams. With each passing minute, The initial nervousness I'd felt gave way to a comfortable familiarity. Daniel was thoughtful and attentive, listening as much as he spoke, asking questions that showed he was truly interested in my answers. When he laughed, that same infectious laugh I'd heard through the walls, I found myself wanting to hear it again and again. There was a genuineness to him that felt increasingly rare in a world of carefully curated social media personas and first-date performances. As we finished our meal, Daniel insisted on helping with the dishes despite my protests. "My mother raised me better than to eat and run," he said, already collecting our bowls. "Besides, I'm not quite ready to head back to my empty apartment just yet." Standing side by side at the sink, our hands occasionally touching as we passed dishes back and forth, I felt a contentment I hadn't experienced in a long time. There was something beautifully ordinary about the moment, and yet, at the same time, it felt significant, like a page turning to reveal a new chapter. "I have a confession to make," Daniel said as he dried the last bowl, his voice taking on a playful tone. "I actually had plenty of salt in my apartment." I turned to him, surprised. "You did? Then why?" "I've been trying to work up the courage to knock on your door for weeks," he admitted, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "I've seen you coming and going, always with a smile for everyone you pass. I heard you singing along to that Florence and the Machine album last weekend. I smelled your cooking and imagined what it would be like to share a meal with you." He set down the towel, his expression open and vulnerable. "When I smelled your cooking today, it felt like the universe was giving me a sign. So I invented a reason to knock." The confession touched me deeply. In a city where connections often remain surface level, where dating apps have replaced serendipitous meetings, there was something wonderfully old-fashioned about a neighbor finding the courage to knock on a door. "I'm glad you did," I said simply, because sometimes the simplest truths are the most powerful. Daniel's smile in response was soft, a little shy. "Me too." He glanced at his watch reluctantly. "I should probably head back. I have early classes tomorrow." We walked to the door together, the short distance somehow feeling significant. At the threshold, Daniel turned to face me. "Thank you for dinner. And for more than dinner," he said, his eyes meeting mine with warmth and something like hope. "Thank you for the salt," I replied with a smile. "And for stirring my pot with your finger, which I'm still not sure I've forgiven you for." Daniel laughed, that wonderful laugh that seemed to fill all the spaces in my apartment. "I'll have to find ways to make it up to you." "I'm sure you will," I said, surprised by my own boldness. There was a moment of hesitation, a breath where possibility hung in the air between us. Then Daniel leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to my cheek, his lips warm against my skin. "Good night, Alex," he said softly. "I'm just across the hall if you ever need to borrow anything. Salt, sugar." He paused, his smile turning playful. "Time." After he left, I stood in my kitchen, the space still somehow holding his presence. The pot was clean now, the stew stored in containers in the refrigerator. But something had changed in my apartment, in me, that wouldn't be so easily contained. I ran my fingers along the counter where Daniel had leaned, remembering the way he dipped his finger into my stew with that mischievous smile. Such a small moment, really. Insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And yet, sometimes the smallest moments are the ones that change everything. As I got ready for bed that night, I thought about how cooking had always been my way of creating connection, with my grandmother's memory, with friends, with my own sense of self. Now it had created something new, something unexpected and full of potential. I fell asleep thinking about hazel eyes and borrowed salt, about fingers stirring pots and gentle kisses on cheeks, about how sometimes the most extraordinary beginnings come disguised as ordinary moments. And in the morning, when I opened my door to head to work, I found a small package leaning against it. Inside was a beautiful wooden spoon with a note attached, for future taste tests. No fingers required, unless requested. "Coffee sometime, Daniel." I smiled, tucking the note into my pocket like a promise. Sometimes a neighbor borrows salt and stays to stir your pot. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they stir something else entirely. Something that had been waiting all along for just the right ingredient to bring it to life. Total _char_count, 18,457.